Okay, so first off, right, response paper 3 is now going to be due this Friday, and if, as was the case this past week, if I've forgotten to change the due dates and reopen the folder, just let me know, because sometimes I slip on things like that. We're going to be reading Chapter 7 in Studying English, right? So today we're going to be talking about defenses of the canon, and we're going to look at how preservation of the canon and attacks on the canon work in practice, using Shakespeare as an example next time. Right, so that's what we're going to be looking at next time. But today I'd like to continue talking, as we did last time, about the idea of the literary canon, how it comes about and how it shapes much of what is done in English classes. So can somebody remind me what we're talking about when we talk about a canon? What is a canon or the canon? Yeah, a canon is a set of texts that experts regard as exemplary or important, right? And the idea of a canon, right, the idea that there are these books that everyone in a given culture should read in order to be educated, is what has shaped a lot of your literary education up to this point, right? A lot of books you would have been given in school to read are chosen not necessarily because your teachers think they would interest you, but because they are canonical, right? Because they are part of this set of accepted, received texts that are regarded as part of our common culture. So, what I'd like you guys to think about first, before we really get started talking about the arguments in the text that you read for the texts that you read for today, is if you were setting up a canon, if you were to decide what was in a canon of literature, right, what would be your criteria for inclusion? And we'll just capitalize the canon to demonstrate its importance. So yeah, just take a couple minutes. Write this out. Think about the kinds of principles you would follow in trying to lay out a canon. You know, would you go for historical importance? Would you go for widespread influence? Would you go for aesthetic quality? Would you go for diversity and inclusion? Right? These are all the kinds of things that people think about when we talk about the canon and canon construction. Right? So just take a couple minutes. Think about that. Think about what you think is important in establishing a set of texts that everyone in a culture is expected to read. And be prepared to read aloud and discuss your criteria when you're done. How are we doing here? Anybody feel like they need another minute or two? Or do you feel like you got something? Or at least enough to work with? Okay. So, Maya, do you want to start us off? All right.
So, like, when talking about the canon, like, first thing, I want to read something that's kind of interesting to me. And so I separated into something that's like a set for entertainment and another set for informational.
Okay.
So, like, for the informational side, something has to have historical value. Of course, it has to be fact-checked.
Okay.
Promotes critical thinking.
Historical value, factual accuracy.
Yeah. Addresses like social issues and something that I can relate to.
Okay.
And for like the entertainment side, I like fantasy, something I can use my imagination.
Okay.
Things like conspiracies, and also things that deal with multiple dimensions or like alternate realities.
Okay. All right. Sabrina, what about you?
I said that my canon would include things that bring about like social, cultural influence.
Okay.
Something that brings about historical understanding. Things or texts with progressive literature styles. But also like traditional canon conclusions.
Okay, can you repeat that last part? It was a little quiet. I didn't quite hear you.
Traditional inclusions, so like in just about every canon you see like LIC or Beowulf. Even if you don't think
Okay.
they're particularly good, I think they're still important.
Okay, so on some level, one does need to trust tradition then. Okay, good. Bethany.
I said moral character and technical qualities.
Okay.
Does the piece teach a lesson? And what devices are used? Setting, characterization, learning? Stuff like that.
Okay, so you are looking at really kind of both moral and kind of aesthetic concerns here, right? Okay, Nick.
Stuff that is an idea of life in a certain time.
Okay. So I think we can just kind of chalk that to historical value, right?
Works that compare and contrast on certain ideas, especially if they're like in a contemporary area at the time.
Okay, so you would like to see works included from different perspectives?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Works that show acceptance or adversity to things, events in history,
All right.
or just acceptance or adversity to ideas.
Okay, anything else?
I got one. Works that allude to works that allude to older works that while also implementing new ideas.
Okay, so tradition and innovation, right? Okay.
Works that give opinions on literary norms.
Okay.
And I wrote this down while she was saying it works with factual accuracy.
Okay. Shit, you weren't kidding. All right. And Sean, what about you?
Kind of works good historical value. Really kind of makes them think about lessons of history and really just how not to repeat them in the future.
Okay.
Really text from other cultures to budget forward go around them. Try to find different solutions to maybe the same problem, possibly, or problem.
Okay. All right. Anything else? Okay, so one thing I've noticed that seems to be running through most of what you guys are saying is that on some level there is some value for tradition and the historical importance, the historical accuracy of particular works. But apart from that, it looks like a lot of you are actually looking for very different things. In what you remember too, that what we're doing here is not trying to establish simply what we would prefer to read, but what we think others should read too, right? So the canon is about, kind of like, it's a kind of prescriptive list of what people ought to be reading. So we need to be thinking about this in terms of theories of education, what we think other people should be learning. I think you guys are doing that. I think that you are taking this in that kind of direction. I'm not going to take any specific position on the canon today. Like, what I think should be in it, whether or not I think there should be one, that sort of thing. I think that I've made previous statements that probably make pretty clear what my position is on canons. And a lot of what I think about them can probably be inferred over the next couple of sessions, right? But it is a central concept in the discipline, and so we really do need to kind of like work through and understand how they come to be, who puts them together, and how they're used, right? So the three pro-canon arguments that I had you read for today were T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent, which was first published in 1919. The first chapter of E.D. Hirsch's book, Cultural Literacy, What Every American Should Know, which was published in 1987. And Harold Bloom's, the first chapter and the table of contents of Harold Bloom's The Western Canon, published in 1994. So Hirsch and Bloom are occupying more or less the same historical moment. Hirsch is actually still alive. Bloom just died recently. Eliot is, in a lot of ways, the father of the modern idea of the canon. With his notion, he doesn't call it a canon. He talks about tradition and is concerned with its relationship to the individual writer, the individual poet in particular. But one thing we might want to think about when we look at Eliot first is context. If we look at the year 1919, what had just ended?
World War I.
World War I, yes. So he's writing this as World War I has just come to a close. He himself has been impacted by the war. He was an American graduate student who could not return to the U.S. from England to complete his PhD because of wartime conditions. It wasn't safe to travel. So he stuck around in England and started working in a bank and writing poetry. What else that might be relevant to what's going on today had also kind of just closed out? Think about why we're all wearing masks and gloves. Or where I'm wearing gloves anyway, you guys aren't. I have to touch a lot more things than you do.
You said closed out, but I think we're still.
Tuberculosis.
What's that?
Tuberculosis.
Not tuberculosis, but you're thinking along the right lines, right? There was also the Spanish flu pandemic, right? Which hit North America and most of Europe. No, there's no E at the end of flu. So he's writing at a time of instability in which much of what constituted the old aristocratic political order of Europe has just crumbled away, right? Has essentially kind of destroyed itself. These old aristocracies have destroyed themselves on the battlefield. The Russian Empire has fallen. The German monarchy is being replaced by a republic, right? So all of these old things are going away. Not to mention, a shit ton of people died, and a lot of, there was a lot of destruction, not just of landscape, but also of important monuments, cultural artifacts, things like that, right? So we're dealing with a period of sort of like trying to come back from a near total devastation. And so tradition seems like maybe kind of comforting thing to start with. It's like, okay, like this can be a kind of bedrock foundation that we can build on, right? Now, the more immediate context for Hirsch and Bloom is what we call the culture wars of the 80s and 90s. And the culture wars arguably never really went away or ended. But the way the culture wars worked in academic departments, right? They tended to be between defenders of the older styles of the humanities, who preferred to focus on things like aesthetic value and tradition. So defenders of the traditional canons of literature and history. And reformers who were promoting kind of new humanities that were based primarily on critical inquiry, questioning of older modes of thought, and ideas of diversity and inclusion in what had been some very, very white male disciplines. Right. In fact, if we look, and one thing to note about both Bloom and Hirsch is that politically, like in terms of how they vote, the candidates and policies they supported, they were both liberals. But they were both on the conservative side of this fight. They both preferred the older idea of the humanities. Something closer to what somebody like John Crowe Ransom was arguing for, right? Now, Ransom and Eliot and those on their side in 1937 were arguing that their method was apolitical, right? That there were no politics associated with aesthetic value. But the response to that is that, like, no, like even saying that what you're doing is not political is simply a kind of reinforcement of status quo thinking, right? Saying that you are able to say that what your work is not political because you're in a position where you're not directly affected by politics. But if you are continuing to promote a means of reading that values white European authors and texts over texts from other traditions, and that continues to make and promote white European aesthetic assumptions about what is good and what is not, then yeah, what you're doing is political. And again, like, I'm not defending or attacking either side here. I'm just trying to give you what the positions were, right? And we see this, like, if we look, there's a reason I wanted you guys to see the table of contents of Bloom's book. So let's just pull that up and take a quick look at it now. Come on, there we go. And we'll just, take a look at who he devotes space and chapters to it. So there are 26 authors total in Bloom's Western canon. And by and large, they're the expected names, right? So we're talking about like kind of like pan-Western European literature here, right? So not just English or American, right? So we've got Shakespeare, we've got Dante, Chaucer, Cervantes, Montaigne and Molière, Milton, Samuel Johnson, Goethe, Wordsworth and Jane Austen, Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Charles Dickens and George Eliot, Tolstoy, Ibsen, Freud. No, I can't. Oh, that's 2 chapters on Freud. Proust, Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Franz Kafka, Borges, Neruda, and Pessoa. They're Latin American poets with whom you might not be as familiar. Samuel Beckett, James Joyce, Marcel Proust, William Shakespeare again, right? So of the 26 names, what do you notice most of them have in common? In terms of demographics. We thought a little bit about this when you guys were constructing your own canon when we talked last time. Yeah, 24 out of 26 are white men, right? And of the 4 white women who are on Bloom's list, only 2 of them are given their own chapters, right? Only Emily Dickinson and Virginia Woolf get chapters to themselves. George Eliot and Jane Austen share chapters with another writer, right? So, in Bloom's defense, he later said that he hadn't really intended this, that his editor just asked him for 26 names, and this is what he thought of off the top of his head, and that he didn't necessarily stand by this list as the 26 most important writers in the European tradition, or in the Western tradition. But there are things that he says later in the essay that suggest things about his particular values, right? But let's think a little bit about the essay. So before we go any further into this, I want to ask if you guys have any particular questions or comments about any of these 3 essays. No? Okay, then let's talk first about the Eliot in detail, because this is the oldest, and this is going to be the one that the others are riffing on. Really that almost any discussion of the canon after 1920 is riffing on. So Eliot begins by trying to essentially reframe our definition of tradition here, right? He says, in English writing, we seldom speak of tradition, though we occasionally apply its name in deploring its absence. We cannot refer to the tradition or to a tradition. At most, we employ the adjective in saying that the poetry of so-and-so is traditional or even too traditional. Seldom, perhaps, does the word appear except in a phrase of censure. If otherwise, it is vaguely approbative, with the implication as to the work approved of some pleasing archaeological reconstruction. You can hardly make the word agreeable to English ears without this comfortable reference to the reassuring science of archaeology. Okay, so what is he saying about the way tradition is typically used in reference to literature?
It either is or isn't. Or
Okay, so a work either is or isn't traditional, right? But what are the two uses he sees other critics making of this particular word? Seldom, perhaps, does the word appear except in a phrase of censure, right? As in too traditional. So he's saying that tradition is often used by critics as a bad thing, right? If something is too traditional, it means it's not original enough, right? If otherwise, it is vaguely approbative, that is vaguely approving, with the implication, as to the work approved, of some pleasing archaeological reconstruction, right? So it's either not original or it's a work of pleasant but unremarkable nostalgia, right? That gives you those kinds of warm, funny, fuzzy feelings that you get, like, when you see a cereal that you used to like as a kid on the supermarket shelf or something like that, right? I still get all warm and fuzzy when the monster cereals come back at Halloween, which when I was a kid were available year-round. Certainly the word is not likely to appear in our appreciations of living or dead writers. Every nation, every race has not only its own creative but its own critical turn of mind, and is even more oblivious of the shortcomings and limitations of its critical habits than those of its creative genius. So one thing he's doing here is connecting the idea to some kind of national consciousness, right? Which is exactly the kind of thing that Hirsch is going to be picking up when talking about the sorts of background knowledge he thinks all Americans should have. We know, or think we know, from the enormous mass of critical writing that has appeared in the French language, the critical method or habit of the French, we only conclude, we are such unconscious people, that the French are more critical than we, and sometimes even plume ourselves a little with the fact, as if the French were the less spontaneous. Perhaps they are, but we might remind ourselves that criticism is as inevitable as breathing, and that we should be none the worse for articulating what passes in our mind when we read a book and feel an emotion about it, for criticizing our own minds in their work of criticism, right? So basically, we should understand what it is we're doing when we are thinking about how we want to approach a work of literature critically, right? We need to think about our processes here. One of the facts that might come to light in this process is our tendency to insist, when we praise a poet, upon those aspects of his work in which he least resembles anyone else. In these aspects or parts of his work, we pretend to find what is individual, what is the peculiar essence of the man. We dwell with satisfaction upon the poet's difference from his predecessors, especially his immediate predecessors. We endeavor to find something that can be isolated in order to be enjoyed. Whereas if we approach a poet without this prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best, but the most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously, And I do not mean the impressionable period of adolescence, but the period of full maturity. So what is he saying we tend to value about a poet's work when we read it, and in its relationship to tradition? What do we tend to value?
Originality.
Yeah, we prefer originality, right? We want to see something new. We want to see something individual. And why does he think that's wrong? What does he think we should be considering instead? What does he think might actually be the most individual parts of a writer's work?
When the people before the writer come up with some sort of norm or some sort of idea, and it is put through the writer of the works work, like it shows.
Yeah, it's framed here almost as a kind of conversation, right? That where the writer is in conversation with the tradition, right, with the poets that have come before him, might actually be where he is most interesting, not where he's inventing things out of whole cloth. So this relationship to tradition, with a capital T, is what Eliot is most interested in here, and what he thinks other critics don't pay enough attention to. How does the individual poet revise, update, and converse with the tradition, right? So what Eliot presents to us is an idea of a tradition that is actually malleable, right? It is actually flexible to some extent. And it's flexible in that while it is already whole and complete at any given time, whenever a new work is added to it, not only does the tradition get bigger, but that new work then changes the way we read all those works that come before it, right? So what he's looking for readers to do, or for writers to do, is to essentially revise and update the way we see the tradition, right? So his criteria for inclusion here is exactly this kind of relationship to the tradition of the past, right? Now what this assumes then is kind of like a relatively unbroken chain of influence, right? So if, say, we start with Homer, and thinking solely of the English tradition, we move from Homer to Chaucer, who is influenced by Homer, right? To Shakespeare, who is influenced by Chaucer, to Wordsworth, who was influenced by Shakespeare, to, Tennyson, who was influenced by Wordsworth, and then, maybe say to T.S. Eliot, who was influenced by Tennyson, or at least responding to Tennyson in some way, right? How does this then deal with authors who are outside of your particular cultural tradition? Is there an easy way to include writers who are coming from a different cultural perspective? say from a non-European cultural perspective, or from a different position even within a European-based culture. It is very much tied to a particular definition of national character, right? So it's kind of expected, for example, that an English poet writing in 1919 is going to know Chaucer, but it's not going to be expected that he also knows, say, the Bhagavad Gita or the Mali epic of Sanjata, or anything from any other tradition, right? The focus of the tradition is relatively narrow. And I think that Hirsch and Bloom are both thinking here along similar lines. Does anybody have any questions about Eliot before we continue? I think there might be one or two more things that... So this is Eliot's description of how this process works, right, on the second page of the essay. Right, to proceed to a more intelligible exposition of the relation of the poet to the past. Right? So we can see also something about Eliot's style also tells us something about his values. What kind of words does he like to use? Does he use relatively simple, straightforward, Anglo-Saxon type words, or does he use a lot of kind of long, complex Latinate words and pile phrases on top of each other? It's the second one, right? So it's clear that he also kind of then values a kind of erudite scholarly tradition, right? He even writes in that particular mode. To proceed to a more intelligible exposition of the relation of the poet to the past, he can neither take the past as a lump, as an indiscriminate bolus, nor can he form himself wholly on one or two private admirations, nor can he form himself wholly upon one preferred period. The first course is inadmissible, the second is an important experience of youth, and the third is a pleasant and highly desirable supplement. The poet must be very conscious of the main currents, which does not at all flow invariably through the most distinguished reputations. He must be quite aware of the obvious fact that art never improves, but the material of art is never quite the same. He must be aware that the mind of Europe, the mind of his own country, a mind which he learns in time to be more important than his own private mind, is a mind which changes, and that this change is a development which abandons nothing en route, which does not superannuate either Shakespeare or Homer or the rock drawing of the Magdalenian draftsman. So nothing goes out of date in the tradition, right? Everything is always current, even going back to cave paintings. That this development, refinement perhaps, complication certainly, is not, from the point of view of the artist, any improvement, perhaps not even an improvement from the point of view of the psychologist, or not to the extent which we imagine, perhaps only in the end based upon a complication in economics and machinery. But the difference between the present and the past is that the conscious present is an awareness of the past in a way, and to an extent, which the past's awareness of itself cannot show. So the idea here being that in the present, we are more aware of the past than the past is of itself. Does that make sense? Right, so we're already looking at the past with the perspective of more and different experience. And our experience in the present shapes the way we read the past. So this keeps everything in the tradition fresh, because we're always looking at it through the eyes of a different historical moment and applying the lessons of different historical moments. So this is actually a little bit close to what is sometimes called reader response. Theory, right? The idea that what's most important in reading a text is the experiences, assumptions, and other assorted intellectual detritus that you bring to it, right? That what you bring to the text is more important in your reading of it than anything that the author intended, or that can be drawn from a sociological or historical study or anything like that, right? Okay. Any questions? Everybody good? Everybody with me? Okay, good. All right, so let's have a quick look then at the E.D. Hirsch, because it's a little bit earlier. So what's the situation in this chapter, the cultural situation that E.D. Hirsch is lamenting? What does he have a problem with? So Eliot is responding to what he thinks is a flawed idea or an incomplete idea of what tradition is, right? And he's trying to revise the way we see tradition and originality in art. Is Hirsch necessarily concerned with the state of art? What is he worried about? What has got him freaked out?
Loss of tradition?
Pardon?
Loss of tradition?
In a sense, right? He is worried about the loss of tradition. He is worried about, in particular, what he sees as the erosion of any kind of shared culture in the United States. So one of the examples he gives us, right, is that in order to read a short newspaper article and understand it, there is certain background knowledge that the writer of that article expects everyone who reads it to have, right? If it's, say, an article about a court case, right? They talk about appeals and they talk about different federal agencies using alphabet soup and things like that, right? They expect that you know what those acronyms mean and you know what those agencies do. They expect that you know how the court system works and you know what an appeal is and things like that, right? And that much of the writing that's done even in business often assumes a certain level of cultural competency, right? And not just cultural competency when it comes to business culture, but say cultural competency when it comes to our kinds of shared cultural and artistic traditions, right? So he talks about like how his father used to quote Shakespeare in business memos, right? In part because it was sort of pithier and more efficient than spelling out exactly what he meant in longer sentences. And that he doesn't see the contemporary generation of business executives being able to do the same sort of thing, because knowledge of Shakespeare has eroded in the generation he's talking about, right? There are fewer people who know enough Shakespeare to be able to make allusions to him. Now, this may seem to us relatively trivial, right? This may seem like a sort of quibbling concern. Hirsch's worry was that lack of cultural literacy was going to put those who were already elites much further ahead of those who were starting from a place of disadvantage. Right? That the fact that students who went to better funded schools in wealthier districts were learning different things from students who attended poorly funded schools in poverty-ridden districts, right? That the things that these wealthier students are learning are going to continue to give them advantages, because they will have a shared medium of communication while disadvantaged students will remain so because they can't break into that club. So there is a humanitarian impulse at work here, right? There is a kind of genuine desire to help, but I think it would also be fair to say that it is a little bit paternalistic, right? And he does seem to make some assumptions about what is valuable culture and what is not, that are not too different from the ones Eliot is making, right? And a lot of this can sound a little bit like old man whining about kids these days and what they don't know. Even as it is kind of like coming from a genuine place of worry, right? So the big thing that Hirsch seems to want is a nationalized educational curriculum. Now, this does not, like, he never mentions a canon specifically, but much of what he argues for here assumes something like a canon in the background, right? That there is this set of approved texts that everybody ought to be learning, right? So one of the problems that he points out with our educational system is that we do have this patchwork of local systems and state systems that all set their own requirements. Depending, like, I don't know, for example, for sure, when you guys arrive in my classroom, what you learned in high school. Even if I know where you went to high school, even if you all went to the same high school, because different students get tracked differently and take different courses, different school districts set different requirements for graduation, students are given more choice sometimes in what kinds of classes they prefer to take. So this leaves, say, the university instructor of English with a dilemma in that I often don't know, like I don't necessarily know where to start with all of you. Now, a lot of this can be corrected, I find, by asking you what you know and working from there, right? That way, I know where the gaps in your background knowledge are, and I know what I need to fill in. But Hirsch's thinking has been a big influence on, I'm sure many of you have heard the words Common Core discussed in terms of it. Does anybody know what Common Core is?
Everybody that's studying and like, they have standards, they have problems. I don't feel it's like standard
Yeah. The idea is to set national K-12 benchmarks, right? Which aren't necessarily based on people taking specific classes or reading specific books, right? But it's what they've come up with is a little bit more skills based, and it's more like, okay, like this is what you should know how to do by the end of first grade. This is what you should know how to do by the end of second grade, right? And there are a lot of horror stories about parents not being able to help their kids with math homework anymore, right? But that actually has nothing to do with the Common Core. But yeah, the basic point here, right, is that he's arguing for cultural cohesion through education, right? Through emphasis on some kind of shared tradition, as opposed to simply teaching students skills that they can apply to, say, anything that they read, right? He's arguing that the content of what you're reading is as important as the skills that you're getting from reading it, right? That it is actually important for people to memorize and learn the content of canonical texts. Right, so, lastly, we turn our attention to Harold Bloom. So Bloom's idea of the canon is based in something that is actually kind of similar to Eliot's idea of the tradition, but moves in a slightly different direction. So remind me when Eliot talks about the tradition and the poet's relationship to it, right? How does he see the new poet in relation to the tradition? What's the new poet doing in relation to the tradition? They're conversing with the past, right? They're not just replicating past structures or past poems, right? James Joyce doesn't just, look at the Odyssey and say, oh, I'm going to imitate that, right? Instead, he takes the basic structure and plot of the poem and works it into a very, very different form, right? An experimental novel transplanted to present day, where the action is transplanted to present day Dublin. So he's updating and conversing with the tradition, altering the way we look at it, not simply repeating. And Bloom's idea is basically similar. So Bloom was best known for a slightly idiosyncratic theory that is referred to as the anxiety of influence. Have any of you heard this term before? Is this at all? No? Okay. He used to be a lot more influential than he now is. But the basic idea of the anxiety of influence, right, is that young writers begin by idolizing and imitating some important predecessor, right? So one of the examples that he uses in the book, The Anxiety of Influence, is Shakespeare being really impressed with the work of his early contemporary Christopher Marlowe and wanting to write like Marlowe. The problem the young writer then encounters is that they then can't find anything new to say, right? They undergo a kind of paralysis. Because they look at this older writer and they're like, well, shit, he already said everything I thought I wanted to say, right? He's done everything I wanted to do. Where can I go from here? And so, through creative misreading, or what Bloom calls misprision, the young writer sets up the former hero as an adversary to be toppled. And so takes and revises that older writer's work in a way that says something completely different and new, right? In a way that makes the older writer's work unrecognizable, right? And this is, for Bloom, the difference between a strong writer and a weak writer. And a weak writer continues to imitate and can't get out from under that shadow of influence. A strong writer, there's something kind of Nietzschean about this. A strong writer manages to overcome the influence and become greater than the influence, right? Through this process of creative misreading, right? So, Bloom's idea of the canon basically works the same way, right? he makes Shakespeare the kind of central figure of it. Shakespeare is the focal point of Bloom's canon, the writer with whom all other writers in the Western tradition are constantly wrestling. And we talk about Shakespeare, the Shakespeare requirement and the idea of Castle Shakespeare in English departments. Next time we'll go into this kind of thing in a little bit more depth. But the basic quality that Bloom identifies in writing that is canonical is the union of tradition and strangeness. Right, you take that traditional material, that conversation with tradition, and you make it weird enough that it still gives your reader something of that, like that shock of the new, right? So you're not simply just repeating what Shakespeare did or what Chaucer did or Dante or Goethe or whoever, that you're taking what they're doing and updating it, right? You're looking at it through fresh, different eyes. And the strangeness is the basis of aesthetic value. And this leads into what's probably the most contentious and argumentative portion of Bloom's piece. Harold Bloom thought no small bit of himself, and was a little bit dismissive of critical modes with which he personally disagreed. So if we look on page 3 of this here, there's a paragraph here that says, right, Shakespeare, the largest writer we ever will know, frequently gives the opposite impression of making us at home out of doors, foreign abroad. His powers of assimilation and of contamination are unique and constitute a perpetual challenge to universal performance and to criticism. I find it absurd and regrettable that the current criticism of Shakespeare, cultural materialist, neo-Marxist, neo-historicist, Foucault, feminist, has abandoned the quest to meet that challenge. Shakespeare is in full flight from his aesthetic supremacy and works at reducing him to the Shakespeare criticism is in full flight from his aesthetic supremacy and works at reducing him to the social energies of the English Renaissance, as though there were no authentic difference in aesthetic merit between the creator of Lear, Hamlet, Iago, Falstaff, and his disciples, such as John Webster and Thomas Middleton. So it's clear that Bloom is coming from a kind of combination of objective and expressive approaches, right? He's concerned with aesthetic value, but never really clearly defined, like, apart from the strangeness aspect, never clearly defines what makes one work better than another, right? He is very adamant that Shakespeare is the best, but seems to take that for granted, right? And not to feel he needs to explain why that is. Like, why is Shakespeare superior to John Webster and Thomas Middleton? Thomas Middleton actually wrote parts of some of Shakespeare's plays. Just going to throw that out there. And it's also clear that he is hostile to those forms of criticism that are concerned with things outside of the text, or how the text is affected by or represents the outside world. He's clearly hostile to historicist readings of the text and to feminist readings of the text, right? In fact, he'll dub people who criticize the idea of the canon for not being inclusive, a little bit later in the essay, the school of resentment. And I try to present this neutrally and without, adding my own particular political or emotional spin on this, but as somebody who kind of belongs to that school of resentment, I gotta admit that when I read this essay, I get a little bit pissed off sometimes. Because I feel like he is genuinely dismissive of other potential approaches. But yeah, so Bloom is primarily concerned with conserving what he regards as the aesthetic supremacy of a particular set of authors, right? The characteristics of which we have already discussed. So this, like all three of these essays are fairly typical of what we call defenses of the canon, right? They're very much concerned with tradition, with preservation of a common culture, and with the relationship between the artist and that particular common culture, right? We're going to be looking again in the coming weeks at critics who are much less accommodating to the notion of a canon, particularly the idea of a canon like Bloom's or like Eliot's. Okay, so anybody have any questions about anything? All right, so response paper 3 is going to be due Friday. What I'd like you to do is focus on one of these defenses of the canon, try to pick it apart. You can take any tack with it you like, right? You can try to defend a defense, you can try to pick apart a defense, whatever you prefer doing, right? Okay, so I will see you all on Monday, and let's get started taking the room down.